Picture this. You're standing at the entrance of your high school cafeteria, plastic tray in hand, mystery meat on your plate, 400 kids, 50 tables, and you've got exactly 3 seconds to make the most important decision of your day. Not what to eat, where to sit. Because in American high schools of the 90s, your social status wasn't determined by your grades, your family's money, or even your looks. It was determined by one simple choice: which table you ate lunch at. And this system, it was more rigid than medieval feudalism. Welcome to cafeteria politics, the most honest education you never knew you were getting. But here's what's going to blow your mind. By the end of this story, I'm going to reveal the one table that could make you popular overnight, the secret alliance that controlled more power than the quarterback, and the dark psychological experiment that every single one of us participated in without even knowing it. Every American high school cafeteria looked like a carefully designed social experiment. And that wasn't an accident. Think about it. Who designed these spaces? School administrators who understood crowd control. Architects who studied human behavior. They created amphitheaters of adolescent anxiety, perfect laboratories for studying teenage tribal warfare. Center tables, prime real estate, reserved for royalty. Corner tables, social Siberia. The walkways between, neutral territory where deals were made and alliances were broken. But the genius was in the details. The lunch line itself was a gauntlet. You had to walk past every single table, every single click, carrying your tray like a social resume. Rich kid with pizza and cookies? Everyone knew. Poor kid with the bright orange free lunch ticket? The cafeteria ladies. These women were the true power brokers. They knew your family's financial situation better than your bank. They knew which kids were going hungry at home. They knew which popular kids were actually broke. And sometimes, just sometimes, they'd slip an extra roll to the kid who needed it most. But here's the crazy part. None of this was written down. No handbook. No orientation. This entire social operating system was passed down like oral tradition, from senior class to freshman class, year after year after year. The rules weren't posted on any wall, but break them, you'd find out real quick. Because in high school, social death was worse than actual detention. At least detention ended at 3 o'clock. Meet the ruling class. Let's take a deep dive into the power structure of 1990-something. And trust me, this wasn't just movie magic. This was anthropology in action. The jock empire. Lords of the center ring. The athletes owned the center of the cafeteria, like it was their personal throne room. But here's what Hollywood got completely wrong. It wasn't just about being good at sports. It was about being good at the right sports. The quarterback sat at the head table, like a king holding court. Around him, in carefully orchestrated concentric circles, sat the varsity players ranked by sport hierarchy. Football first, obviously, then basketball, but only if you were starting 5. Baseball had its season, but baseball players in February? They were just tall guys with good hand-eye coordination. Soccer players? Forget it. Tennis team? You might as well have played chess. Wrestling was complicated, respected for toughness, but viewed as slightly unhinged. Swimmers were athletic, but somehow didn't count. Track and field? Only if you were a sprinter. Distance runners were just masochists with good cardio. But here's the secret power structure nobody talks about. The team managers. These kids had access to the inner circle without the pressure of performance. They knew all the gossip, all the drama, all the secrets. Smart managers leveraged this information like currency. They were the CIA of high school social dynamics. The jocks had their own internal politics too. Starting players versus bench warmers. Seniors versus underclassmen. All-state athletes versus regular varsity. And at the very top, the kids who played multiple sports and dated cheerleaders. They were untouchable. The cheerocracy. Power behind the throne. Cheerleaders sat adjacent to the jocks, but make no mistake, they had their own table, their own ruthless hierarchy, their own Game of Thrones level political maneuvering. The head cheerleader wasn't just the best at cheering, she was the best at everything that mattered in high school. Pretty, but not threateningly so. Popular, but not mean enough to create enemies. Smart enough to maintain grades, but not so smart she intimidated the athletes she was supposed to date. Below her, the varsity squad operated like a carefully balanced ecosystem. Each girl had her role, the funny one, the sweet one, the dramatic one, the rebel. But step out of line, challenge the hierarchy, you'd find yourself demoted to JV faster than you could spell spirit fingers. Below her, the varsity squad operated like a carefully balanced ecosystem. Each girl had her role, the funny one, the sweet one, the dramatic one, the rebel. But step out of line, challenge the hierarchy, you'd find yourself demoted to JV faster than you could spell spirit fingers. JV cheerleaders lived in a constant state of audition. Every practice, every game, every social interaction was a tryout for varsity. Some would make it, most wouldn't. The ones who didn't became cautionary tales. Reminders that even proximity to power wasn't guaranteed power. But here's what made the cheerleaders truly dangerous. They controlled information flow between the male and female social hierarchies. They knew which athletes were failing classes, which ones had girlfriend drama, which ones were getting recruited by colleges. They were the diplomatic core of teenage politics. The preps. Old money. New attitude. The preppy kids occupied premium real estate, not because they were the most popular, but because they were the most untouchable. These weren't just rich kids. These were legacy rich kids. Their parents had money. Their grandparents had money. Their trust funds had trust funds. They wore their wealth like armor. Ralph Lauren polo shirts, perfectly pressed khakis, shoes that cost more than most kids' entire wardrobes. But the real power wasn't in the clothes. It was in the connections. Their parents knew the school board members. Their families donated to the athletic department. Their last names were on buildings. This created a fascinating dynamic. The preps didn't need to be popular in the traditional sense because they operated in a parallel power structure. They had their own parties at country clubs, their own social events, their own college admission advantages. High school politics were just a game they were playing while waiting for real life to begin. But don't mistake their privilege for complete immunity. Even preppy kids could fall from grace. Date the wrong person, fail too many classes, get caught in a scandal, and suddenly that trust fund couldn't buy them a lunch table. The burnout corner. The rebels who understood everything. Way in the back corner sat the burnouts. Leather jackets, ripped jeans, and an attitude that screamed, "We don't give a damn about your social hierarchy." But here's the secret that took me years to understand. They weren't rebelling against the system because they didn't get it. They were rebelling because they understood it perfectly. The burnouts had their own sophisticated social structure. They shared cigarettes like communion wine, protected each other from authority like an underground resistance, and never, ever snitched. Their loyalty was earned through shared rebellion, not inherited through family wealth or genetic lottery. These kids were like sociological anthropologists. They sat in the corner observing the entire cafeteria ecosystem, commenting on its absurdities, pointing out its hypocrisies. They were the Greek chorus of high school drama, providing running commentary on the social theater playing out in front of them. And weirdly, some of the most genuine friendships in the whole cafeteria happened at that corner table. When you've already rejected the mainstream social hierarchy, you're free to form connections based on actual compatibility rather than social positioning. Many of these kids were actually brilliant. They just refused to play a game they found morally bankrupt. Some were artists, some were musicians, Some were just too intellectually honest to pretend they cared about homecoming king elections. The academic underground. The revenge of the nerds. The nerds occupied a fascinating position in the ecosystem, traditionally the bottom of the social food chain. But something started changing in the late 90s. This little thing called the internet began to shift the power dynamics. Suddenly, knowing HTML wasn't just dorky, it was profitable. Understanding computers wasn't just academic, it was practical. These kids started building websites for local businesses, helping teachers with technology problems, even tutoring popular kids whose parents were threatening to take away car privileges if grades didn't improve. The smart kids developed their own internal hierarchy. Math team captain, debate team president, National Honor Society officers. Academic decathlon champions were like varsity athletes, except instead of football scholarships, they were getting full rides to MIT. But the real power shift happened when college admissions got competitive. Suddenly, the kids with perfect SAT scores and science fair awards weren't just tolerated, they were courted. Popular kids started befriending nerds, not for homework help, but for college application advice. The academic elite learned to leverage their intellectual capital. They formed study groups that became social networks. They created tutoring services that became social currencies. They turned their biggest weakness, being too smart for the mainstream hierarchy, into their greatest strength. The artists and drama kids, the creative resistance. The drama club table was like a small United Nations of social outcasts. You had theater kids, band geeks, art students, creative writers, and kids who were just too weird for any other table. But unlike other outcasts, they wore their difference like a badge of honor. These kids understood performance in ways that even the popular kids didn't. They knew how to project personality, how to command attention, how to transform themselves through costume and character. In many ways, they were more sophisticated about human psychology than anyone else in the cafeteria. The theater kids especially had their own complex social dynamics. Leading men and women, character actors, tech crew, directors. They created their own status hierarchies based on talent and creativity rather than conventional attractiveness or athletic ability. And here's something interesting. Many of these kids were actually quite popular, just in a different way. They weren't homecoming court popular, but they were memorable. They were the kids everyone knew, even if everyone didn't want to be them. The floaters, masters of social navigation. Then there were the kids who didn't belong to any specific table, the social floaters. These were perhaps the most socially intelligent students in the entire school. They could sit with jocks on Monday, nerds on Tuesday, artists on Wednesday. They were the diplomats of high school politics. Floaters succeeded by being useful to everyone and threatening to no one. They were friendly enough to be welcome anywhere, but not charismatic enough to challenge existing power structures. They were like social Switzerland, neutral, helpful, and surprisingly influential. These kids often became class presidents, not because they were the most popular, but because they were acceptable to the most different groups. They understood coalition building in ways that would serve them well in actual politics later in life. The sacred laws, the unwritten constitution. The unwritten laws of cafeteria politics made international diplomacy look like kindergarten playground rules. These weren't suggestions. They were commandments carved in social stone. Law 1. Seniority rules. Everything. The senior hierarchy wasn't just about age, it was about institutional knowledge. Seniors had survived 4 years of this social battlefield. They knew which teachers to avoid, which bathroom stalls had working locks, which administrators would actually listen to student complaints. But senior privilege came with responsibilities. They were expected to mentor underclassmen, at least within their own social circles. A senior athlete was supposed to help junior varsity players navigate not just the sport, but the social dynamics. Senior cheerleaders taught younger girls not just routines, but how to handle the pressure of being constantly judged. The most powerful seniors weren't necessarily the most popular. They were the most connected across different social groups. The senior who could talk to jocks, nerds, artists, and burnouts. That was real power. Law 2. The invitation protocol. You couldn't just walk up and sit down anywhere. There was a complex diplomatic protocol for changing tables, for temporary visits, for emergency social asylum. Eye contact was the first level of permission. A nod was an invitation. Turning away was a dismissal. The most socially skilled students could navigate these micro-communications like master diplomats. But there were also unspoken emergency provisions. If you were having a crisis, breakup, family drama, academic disaster, even rival social groups would provide temporary sanctuary. The cafeteria had its own version of diplomatic immunity. Law 3. Your tray told your story. The lunch line was like a socioeconomic scanner. Everything about your food choices broadcast information about your family's financial situation, your cultural background, your personal priorities. Pizza and fries? You had spending money and didn't care about health. Salad bar? You were either health conscious or trying to lose weight. Packed lunch from home? Either your family was frugal or your mother cared enough to make your lunch every morning. The bright orange free lunch tickets were like wearing a poor kid sign. Some students would skip lunch entirely rather than reveal their family's financial struggles. Others wore it defiantly, turning economic hardship into a badge of authenticity. But here's what was beautiful about the lunch ladies. They were often the most class-conscious people in the building. They'd slip extra food to hungry kids, pretend not to notice when someone's lunch account was overdrawn, treat every student with dignity, regardless of their payment method. Law 4. Territorial boundaries. Every table had invisible boundaries that extended beyond just the seats. There were walking paths that belonged to certain groups, bulletin board spaces that were claimed territory, even bathroom stalls that had unofficial ownership. The popular kids' path through the cafeteria was like a royal procession. Other students would literally move aside, not out of fear, but out of ingrained social conditioning. The burnouts owned the back exit. The artists controlled the hallway to the music room. The athletes dominated the route to the gym. These territorial claims weren't enforced through violence. They were maintained through collective social agreement. Breaking these boundaries wasn't dangerous. It was just awkward. And in high school, awkward was often worse than dangerous. The psychology of exclusion. Here's where the cafeteria system revealed its truly dark genius. It wasn't just organizing students. It was training them in the psychology of exclusion and inclusion. Every day, hundreds of micro-rejections and acceptances played out. A subtle headshake that meant, "This seat is taken." A welcoming smile that meant, "You can sit here." A completely ignored approach that meant, "You don't exist to us." The students weren't just learning algebra and history. They were learning how social hierarchies function, how power operates, how exclusion feels, how inclusion can be weaponized. The observers. Kids who studied the system. Some students became amateur sociologists, studying the cafeteria dynamics with scientific fascination. They'd sit on the periphery, taking mental notes, understanding the patterns and power structures with scholarly detachment. These observer kids often developed the most sophisticated understanding of human social behavior. They could predict social shifts, identify rising and falling stars, map the invisible networks of influence and alliance. Many of these observers used their knowledge strategically. They'd position themselves as useful to multiple groups, serving as information brokers, social consultants, diplomatic messengers between rival factions. The experimenters. Kids who tested boundaries. Then there were the brave ones who deliberately tested the system. They'd sit at different tables, challenge unspoken rules, attempt social boundary crossing, just to see what would happen. Some of these experiments succeeded spectacularly. A burnout kid who joined the debate team and discovered intellectual respect. An athlete who started hanging with the theater kids and found creative fulfillment. A preppy kid who befriended the outcasts and learned about authenticity. But many experiments failed painfully. The quiet kid who tried to sit with the popular crowd and was politely but firmly frozen out. The academic who attempted to crash the jock table and became a cautionary tale about knowing your place. The casualties. When the system failed, what happened to kids who couldn't find their place anywhere? They became ghosts, existing in the margins, eating in bathrooms, spending lunch periods in the library or empty classrooms. These invisible students developed their own survival strategies. Some became hyper-focused on academics, treating school like a job to be completed rather than a social environment to be navigated. Others found refuge in extracurricular activities, building identity around after-school clubs and weekend activities. The truly lost ones sometimes disappeared entirely, skipping lunch, skipping school, eventually dropping out. The cafeteria system, for all its social education, had no safety net for students who couldn't or wouldn't play the game. And sometimes, tragically, when someone feels completely erased for long enough, they find ways to make sure the world never ignores them again. The late 90s taught America that cafeteria politics weren't just harmless teenage drama. They were creating genuine psychological damage, the secret alliance that controlled everything. Here's the revelation I promised at the beginning. The most powerful group in the cafeteria wasn't the jocks or the cheerleaders or even the rich kids. It was the lunch ladies. Think about it. They controlled the food supply. They knew everyone's financial situation. They could make your day better with an extra cookie, or worse, by being slow with service. They were the only adults who interacted with every single student, every single day. The smart students figured this out early. Be polite to the lunch ladies, learn their names, ask about their families, and suddenly you had allies throughout the school system. These women talked to janitors, talked to teachers, talked to administrators. They were the information network that actually ran the school. A lunch lady who liked you might warn you when the health inspector was coming, so you could avoid the questionable meat. She might slip you extra food when she noticed you looked thin. She might even provide character references when you got in trouble with administration. But cross a lunch lady? Good luck. Your food portions would get smaller. Service would get slower. You'd somehow always end up with the least appetizing options. And if you were really unlucky, word would spread through the lunch lady network to other schools in the district. The real education. What we actually learned. The cafeteria taught lessons that no classroom could provide. We learned about power structures, social hierarchies, economic inequality, psychological manipulation, coalition building, and human nature at its most raw. We learned that popularity was a performance, that social status was fragile, that exclusion was painful, that inclusion was precious. We learned to read micro-expressions, navigate complex social protocols, and understand unspoken rules. Most importantly, we learned that every social system has winners and losers, insiders and outcasts, rulers and subjects. The cafeteria was our first real lesson in how the world actually works outside the protective bubble of family and elementary school friendships. The skills that transferred. The students who thrived in cafeteria politics often became successful in adult life, not because they were inherently better people, but because they'd learned crucial social skills early. They understood how to network, how to build alliances, how to navigate workplace dynamics, how to read rooms and understand power structures. They'd learned that success often depends more on social intelligence than pure talent or intelligence. But the outcasts learned valuable lessons too. They developed independence, authenticity, resilience, and often became the most interesting adults. They'd learned to think for themselves, to question social conventions, to find meaning outside of mainstream approval. The damage that lasted. But the cafeteria system also created lasting psychological damage for many students. The constant social evaluation, the daily rejection or acceptance, the reduction of complex human beings to simple social categories. This left marks that many people carried into adult life. Some former outcasts became successful, but never truly believed in their own worth. Some former popular kids struggled when adult life didn't provide the same clear social hierarchies and constant validation they'd grown accustomed to. The system taught competition over collaboration, exclusion over inclusion, appearance over substance. It rewarded conformity and punished authenticity, which created adults who struggled to be genuine in their relationships and career choices. The end of an era. By the mid-2000s, this rigid system started cracking. Social media changed everything. MySpace, early Facebook. Suddenly you could build social connections outside the cafeteria walls. Kids started finding their tribes online. The outcasts discovered they weren't alone. There were thousands of other kids across the country who shared their interests, their struggles, their perspectives. The popular kids realized their kingdom was smaller than they thought, that their social power didn't extend beyond the school walls. Parents began to understand what their children dealt with every day. Anti-bullying campaigns started. Schools began to recognize that the social environment was as important as the academic curriculum. The lunch table monarchy was slowly losing its power. Students started forming more fluid social groups, sitting with different people on different days, building friendships across traditional social boundaries. Technology began to level the playing field. The kid who could code became as valuable as the kid who could throw a football. Social media influence became a new form of popularity that didn't depend on cafeteria seating arrangements. Modern cafeterias, a different world. Today's school cafeterias look very different. Students have phones, connecting them to social networks beyond their physical location. There are more diverse food options, more awareness of dietary restrictions and cultural differences, more flexibility in seating arrangements. Many schools have implemented programs to prevent social isolation. Lunch buddy systems, mixed-age dining, structured activities during lunch periods. The rigid tribal structure of the 90s has largely dissolved, but human nature hasn't changed entirely. There are still popular kids and outcasts, still social hierarchies and power dynamics. The difference is that these structures are more fluid, more temporary, and hopefully less psychologically damaging. The questions that remain. Looking back, it's worth asking, was this system necessary? Did it serve any positive purpose, or was it simply institutionalized cruelty dressed up as social development? Some argue that it prepared students for the harsh realities of adult life, taught valuable lessons about human nature, created resilience and social intelligence. Others contend that it was simply traumatizing, that it taught exclusion and hierarchy rather than empathy and collaboration. Maybe the truth is that it was both, a necessary evil that provided important social education while causing genuine psychological harm, a system that prepared some students for success while damaging others irreparably. The questions that remain. Looking back, it's worth asking, was this system necessary? Did it serve any positive purpose, or was it simply institutionalized cruelty dressed up as social development? Some argue that it prepared students for the harsh realities of adult life, taught valuable lessons about human nature, created resilience and social intelligence. Others contend that it was simply traumatizing, that it taught exclusion and hierarchy rather than empathy and collaboration. Maybe the truth is that it was both, a necessary evil that provided important social education while causing genuine psychological harm, a system that prepared some students for success while damaging others irreparably. The personal question. Which brings us to the most important question of all. How did your own cafeteria experience shape who you became? Are you still carrying the confidence of the popular table or the resilience of the outsider corner? Did you learn to include or exclude, to build bridges or maintain boundaries? The lunch table you chose didn't just feed your body. It fed your understanding of where you fit in this world, how you relate to power, how you treat people who are different from you, how you respond when you're included or excluded. We're all still carrying those cafeteria lessons with us, whether we realize it or not. The question is, what do we want to do with them?